He looked the man dead in the eye from his wheelchair and said 5 words, "I can still fight." The stranger laughed. He'd spent 20 minutes mocking a paralyzed soldier in a roadside diner, and he thought he'd already won. Then the windows began to shake. A sound rolled in off the highway, deep as thunder, closer every second. Chrome flashed in the lot, black leather, 80 winged death's head patches every Californian knows on sight. 80 Hell's Angels were walking through that door, and not one was there for the man in the golf shirt. What happened next shattered everything that diner thought it knew about strength, about weakness, and about who the dangerous man really was. The bell above the door of Rosie's roadside diner had been ringing the same flat note since 1971, and Curtis Holloway knew it the way other men knew their own heartbeat. He rolled his chair across the cracked linoleum, the rubber wheels squeaking over a floor that smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee, and parked at the window table the way he had every Tuesday for the last 6 years. Outside, the flat brown sprawl of Bakersfield baked under a September sun, the kind of heat that wobbled the air above the asphalt of Highway 99 and made the distant oil derricks shimmer like something half-remembered. He was 41 years old, though the lines around his eyes argued for more. His legs, useless below a spine fractured by a roadside bomb outside Kandahar 11 years ago, rested motionless on the footplates of a chair he had long stopped resenting. His shoulders, by contrast, were thick and corded, the shoulders of a man who had spent a decade hauling his own weight through a world built for people who could walk. "Usual Curtis?" Eleanor called from behind the counter. She was 62, silver-haired, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up into the nest of her curls. She owned the place now, had since her husband passed, and she had never once treated Curtis like a thing to be pitied. "Usual, Miss Eleanor," he said. "And keep the coffee coming, hot as you can make it." She smiled and turned to the pot. Curtis pulled a worn paperback from the canvas bag slung over the back of his chair. A history of the Pacific Campaign, the spine cracked white from 100 readings, and settled in. This was the shape of his life now. Small, quiet, predictable. People who saw him assumed the wheelchair was the whole story. They saw the chair and decided everything else about him in half a second. Broken, finished. A man to be helped across a parking lot and then forgotten. He had learned to live inside that assumption the way a man learns to live with a leaky roof. You stopped looking up. You just moved the bucket. The bell rang again. 3 men came in laughing too loud, the way men laugh when they want a room to know they have arrived. They wore the soft, expensive clothes of people who had never worked with their hands. Golf shirts, pressed khakis, sunglasses pushed up into salon haircuts. The one in front was tall and tanned, mid-30s, with the confident slouch of someone who had never been told no. His name, Curtis would later learn, was Spencer Whitfield, and he managed a chain of car dealerships out toward Fresno. They took the booth across the aisle. Spencer's voice carried over the whole diner, complaining about the drive, the heat, the dump they'd stopped at. Eleanor brought menus with a patience that Curtis recognized as armor. For a while, nothing happened. Curtis read. The coffee came and went, and then Spencer noticed him. It started small, the way it always did. A glance, a nudge to his friends, a lowered voice that wasn't lowered enough. "Hey," Spencer said, leaning across the aisle, his smile wide and false. "You serving something, buddy? The chair, I mean. You get that overseas?" Curtis looked up slowly. He had answered this question 1,000 times, in 1,000 tones. He could read the tone before the words finished. This one was not curiosity. This one was sport. "Afghanistan," Curtis said evenly. "Army." "Huh?" Spencer nodded, glancing at his friends with a smirk. "Tough break. So what do you do now? I mean," he gestured vaguely at the chair, "what's a guy like you even do all day?" One of his friends snorted into his soda. Curtis set the book down on the table. He felt the old heat rise in his chest, the one he had spent years learning to keep banked. "I read," he said. "I work. I mind my own business. You should try it. Spencer's smile tightened. He didn't like being answered. Men like him rarely did. Easy, killer, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. Just making conversation. No need to get sensitive. It's not like you can do much else, right? He laughed, and his friends laughed with him, and the sound of it filled the little diner like smoke. Eleanor came around the counter fast. That's enough, she said sharply. You leave him be, or you leave my diner. But Curtis raised a hand. He didn't need her to fight for him. He had never needed anyone to fight for him. That was, in a way, the whole tragedy of him. He looked Spencer dead in the eye, and his voice when it came was quiet and flat and absolutely certain. You think the chair means I can't fight, Curtis said. You've got that exactly backwards. I can still fight. I just choose who's worth it. And you're not. For a second, Spencer's face went blank. Then it hardened into something meaner. He opened his mouth to answer, and that was when the sound rolled in from the highway, distant at first, then closer, a deep mechanical thunder that rattled the diner's old windows in their frames. Curtis turned toward the glass. Outside, coming off the 99 exit in a long, gleaming column, were motorcycles, dozens of them. The afternoon light caught chrome and the black leather and the unmistakable winged death's head patch that every person in California knew on sight. Eleanor went pale. Spencer's smirk faltered, and Curtis Holloway, for the first time in a very long time, felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt since Kandahar. Not fear, recognition. They came in waves, filling the gravel lot until there was no gravel left to see. Only steel and leather, and the slow ticking of cooling engines. 80 riders, give or take, dismounting in a choreography that looked chaotic but wasn't. The Hells Angels had a stop scheduled on their run up the valley, and Rosie's roadside diner, by pure accident of geography, was it? Inside, the temperature of the room seemed to change. Spencer and his two friends had gone very still, their loud confidence draining out through their pressed collars. They had spent the last 20 minutes believing they were the most dangerous men in the building. That belief was dying in real time. Curtis watched it die with a quiet, unfamiliar satisfaction, and then set the feeling aside, because something larger was unfolding. He had heard that particular thunder before, not these machines, but the principle of them, the sound of many men arriving together with a purpose. It was the sound of a unit. He had spent the better part of his 20s living and very nearly dying inside that sound, and his body recognized it before his mind caught up. His pulse settled, his shoulders squared. For the first time in years, the room outside his window felt like a place he belonged in, rather than a place that tolerated him. The bell over the door rang and kept ringing as the riders filed in. They were not what the movies promised. Some were young, some were grey. There was a wiry man in his 60s with a white beard and forearms like cured rope. There was a heavy-set rider with a kind, weathered face and a Vietnam service pin glinting on his vest beside the club colours. There were men who looked like accountants and men who looked like the warnings your mother gave you. They filled the booths and the counter stools and lined up against the walls, and Eleanor, to her enormous credit, simply started making more coffee. The man who seemed to lead them was tall and broad, maybe 55, with iron-grey hair pulled back and a face mapped by sun and miles. His name was stitched over his heart. Russell. The others called him Russ, or Top, and they made room for him without being asked. He swept the room with eyes that missed nothing and stopped on Curtis at the window table. He didn't stop because of the wheelchair. Curtis saw that immediately, and it landed in him like a missing piece clicking home. Russell stopped because of the faded cap on the table beside the coffee cup, the one Curtis wore on the bad days. Stitched across the front, 10th Mountain Division, Afghanistan. Russell walked over, slow and easy, and pulled out the chair across from Curtis without asking, because asking would have been its own kind of insult, the kind that says, I think you need to be handled gently. 10th Mountain, Russell said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Don't call me sir. I worked for a living. A ghost of a smile. 82nd Airborne, long time ago, different war. He nodded at Curtis's legs without flinching from them. Where'd it happen? Outside Kandahar, IED 2014. Curtis held his gaze. Most people looked away when he said it. Russell didn't. Took 2 of my guys with it, I just lost the legs. Russell nodded slowly, and in that nod was an entire conversation that civilians would never hear. The arithmetic of survival, the guilt of the ones who walk away even when they don't walk anymore. You carry that, he said. Not a question either. Every day. Yeah. Russell looked out at his men filling the diner, then back. We do a run every fall. Raise money for vets up and down the valley. Wounded guys, homeless guys, guys the VA forgot about. Most folks see the patches and lock their car doors. He shrugged. Lets us know who they are, saves time. And there it was, the thing the whole afternoon had been circling. Curtis almost laughed. Across the aisle sat Spencer Whitfield in his clean golf shirt, a man who sold cars and looked down on a paralyzed soldier for sport. And across the table sat a man the whole world had prejudged as a criminal, who spent his autumns raising money for exactly the kind of broken soldier Spencer had spent 20 minutes mocking. The 2 men had walked into the same diner wearing their reputations like uniforms. Both uniforms were lies. Russell's eyes drifted to the booth across the aisle, where Spencer was trying very hard to become invisible. "These 3 bothering you?" he asked quietly. Curtis followed his gaze. He thought about it. Really thought about it. The old version of him, the one in Kandahar, would have wanted the satisfaction. But that man had died on a dirt road, and the one in the chair had learned something the loud men never did. "They were," Curtis said. "Then you walked in. Funny how a man's courage runs out the second the people he's scared of show up." Russell laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. A few of the nearer riders turned at the sound. "Funny," he agreed. "Tell you what." He raised his voice, just slightly, just enough to carry. "Boys, this here's Curtis Holloway. 10th Mountain. Left his legs in Kandahar so jokers in golf shirts could drive to lunch in peace." The room went quiet. 80 faces turned toward the window table. "He's drinking with us today. Anybody got a problem with that?" Nobody did. What happened instead was something Curtis would remember for the rest of his life. One by one the riders came over, not in a crowd, not in pity, but the way soldiers approach one of their own. They shook his hand. The Vietnam vet with the kind face gripped his shoulder and held it, and said only, "Welcome home, brother." 2 words the VA had never once thought to say to him. A young rider, barely 25, crouched beside the chair and asked with genuine hunger what the 10th had been like in the mountains. And Curtis found himself talking about the thin, cold air of the Hindu Kush, the way the peaks turned pink at dawn, the brotherhood of men who carried each other up grades that would break a civilian's spirit. He had not spoken of those things in years. He had buried them with the legs, assuming no one wanted the memories of a man the world had filed away. He had been wrong about that too. They didn't see the chair. For the first time in years, in a room full of the most feared men in California, Curtis Holloway was not invisible. He was, of all impossible things, understood. And across the aisle, Spencer Whitfield watched it all and began, slowly, to understand that he had misjudged every single thing about this room, including perhaps himself. The afternoon stretched long and golden. Eleanor had given up on the idea of a normal Tuesday and embraced the chaos, frying eggs and burgers in a steady stream, while a heavy-set rider named Paige, yes, Paige, a woman in full colors who rode a Harley bigger than Curtis's first car, helped her bus tables without being asked. The diner had become something it had never been, loud, warm, alive. Someone had fed the ancient jukebox in the corner, and old country spilled out under the clatter of plates and the low rumble of 40 conversations. Eleanor caught Curtis's eye across the room at one point and shook her head slowly, a small, wondering smile on her face, as if to say, "Can you believe this?" He couldn't. That was rather the point. Curtis found himself at the center of it, and the strangeness of that did not escape him. For 11 years, he had organized his life around the assumption that he would always sit at the edge of every room, the man people stepped around on their way to somewhere better. He had built that assumption into a fortress and called it dignity. Now, men twice his size leaned in to hear what he had to say, and the fortress walls, he realized with some discomfort, had only ever kept him in. But not everything was easy. Somewhere in the second hour, a younger rider named Vincent, lean, restless, a chip on his shoulder you could see from across the room, said the thing that cut. "No offense, man," Vincent said, dropping into the seat Russell had vacated, "but doesn't it eat you up, sitting there? I mean, you were a soldier, now you can't even—" He stopped, hearing himself, but the words were already out on the table, ugly and bare. The room near them quieted. Russell, by the counter, started to move. But Curtis raised a hand again, that small, certain gesture, and Russell stopped. Curtis looked at Vincent for a long moment. He recognized the kid's anger because it was his own, 11 years ago, turned outward instead of in. "What's your name, son?" "Vincent." "How old are you, Vincent?" 26. "You ever been told you were nothing?" Curtis asked. "By a teacher, a father, a cop who saw the leather before he saw the man? You ever have somebody decide who you were in half a second and act on it?" Vincent's jaw tightened. The answer was written all over him. Every man in those colors knew that feeling. It was half of why they wore them. "Yeah," Curtis went on, his voice low and steady, carrying the way a quiet voice does when a room leans in. "You have. So you of all people ought to know better than to do it to me. You looked at this chair, and you decided you knew what my life was, that it ate me up, that I sit here drowning." He shook his head slowly. "I lost my legs, Vincent. I didn't lose my fight. I didn't lose my mind or my worth or my reasons. Every morning I get up, and getting up is harder for me than running a marathon is for you. And I decide all over again that I'm still here for a reason. That's not a man who's drowning. That's a man swimming upstream every single day and not quitting. You want to call that nothing?" The silence that followed was complete. Even the grill seemed to hush. Vincent's face had gone red, then pale, then something softer and more honest. He looked at his own hands. "I'm sorry, man," he said finally, and he meant it. "I'm sorry." "I know," Curtis said. And then, because he understood that shame is a poison only forgiveness draws out, he added, "You ride up here every fall to help guys like me. That tells me more about you than one dumb question does. Sit down. Tell me about your bike." The relief in the room was a physical thing. Vincent grinned, the chip knocked clean off his shoulder, and started talking about a rebuild he'd done on a '74 Shovelhead, a basket case he'd bought for $400 and resurrected over 2 years of nights and weekends. And within minutes, the two of them were arguing about torque specs and carburetor jetting like old friends. Curtis had wrenched on engines before the war. The knowledge came back to his hands the way a language comes back to the tongue. He had forgotten he still had it. He was beginning to suspect there was a great deal about himself he had forgotten on purpose, because remembering had hurt too much to bear alone. Russell watched from the counter, and something in his weathered face shifted. He came over and crouched beside Curtis's chair, lowering his voice so it was just for the two of them. "You handled that better than most preachers could," Russell said. "Kid's got a good heart and a bad mouth. Comes from a rough place." He paused. "Can I ask you something, Curtis?" "Straight. Always. What do you do?" "Eleanor says you come in every Tuesday. You read your books, you go home. That's it?" Russell's eyes were not unkind, but they were direct. "A man like you, sharp, steady, been through the fire and came out the other side still standing, you're letting the chair write your whole story, just like that golf shirt punk did. Just like Vincent almost did. He let that sit. You ever think the only person left in this whole diner, still believing the wheelchair is the end of you, is you?" The words landed hard, because they were true, and Curtis knew it the instant he heard them. For 11 years, He had fought the world's assumptions about him by shrinking, by becoming small and quiet and predictable, by proving he could need nothing and no one. But somewhere along the way, in defending himself from everyone else's small story, he had started believing it too. He opened his mouth. No answer came. Russell stood, clapped him once on the shoulder. "Think about it," he said. "We ride out at 5. But before we go," he glanced toward the parking lot, and a slow grin spread across his face. "There's something I want to show you, something I think a man like you needs to see. You trust me?" Curtis looked up at this stranger the whole world would have crossed the street to avoid, and found that he did. "Yeah," he said, "I trust you." Russell wheeled him out into the September evening himself, refusing all help, and the rest of the club followed in a quiet river of leather and boots. The sun was low now, turning the oil derricks on the horizon to black silhouettes against a sky going orange and rose. 80 motorcycles waited in the lot, and beside them 80 riders, and Curtis had no idea what was about to happen. "There's a thing we do," Russell said, parking the chair at the edge of the gravel. "For the vets we ride for, most of them never get to feel it again. The road, the speed, the wind. The VA gives them a chair and a parking spot and calls it square." "Ah." He nodded toward the far end of the lot, where 2 younger riders were rolling something forward. It was a motorcycle, but not like the others. A custom trike, 3 wheels, low and wide and stable as a tank, with hand controls where the foot pedals should be, and a passenger rig built solid as a church pew. It gleamed candy apple red in the dying light. "Built it ourselves," Russell said, and for the first time his gravel voice caught, just slightly. "Over the winter. Shop time parts the whole thing, 80 guys chipping in. We build one every year, and we give it to a vet who deserves the road back. This year's been sitting in my buddy's garage waiting for the right man." He looked down at Curtis. "I walked into this diner 2 hours ago with no idea who that was. Then some punk in a golf shirt told a paralyzed soldier he couldn't do anything. And the soldier looked him dead in the eye and said, 'I can still fight.'" Russell's jaw worked. "Brother, I've been doing this 20 years. I have never been more sure of a decision in my life. It's yours." The riders had gone quiet behind him. 80 men who had buried friends and outlived enemies, who had been spat at and feared and turned away from 100 doors, stood in the orange light and watched. Some of them had tears standing in their eyes and did not bother to hide it. The young one who'd asked about the mountains had his cap in his hands like he was at a graveside. This, Curtis understood, was their church, the closest thing these outcast men had to a sacrament, and they had chosen him to receive it. For a long moment, Curtis could not speak. He stared at the machine, at the hand controls, at the solid frame, at the thing he had not let himself want in 11 years, because wanting it had felt like begging the universe for something it had already refused him. The wind, the road, the speed. The man he had been before a dirt road outside Kandahar took his legs, and he had let himself believe everything else. He thought of the morning after the field hospital, waking to the flat, white truth of it, deciding in that first hour that he would never again ask the world for anything it could deny him. 11 years he had kept that grim promise. 11 years of wanting nothing so that nothing could be taken. His eyes burned. He had not cried in front of another human being since the field hospital. He did not cry now, but it was close, closer than it had been in a decade. "I can't," he started. "You can," Russell said. "That's the whole point. You've been telling everybody you can still fight. Time to find out what else you can still do." It took 4 men to transfer him into the rig, gentle and matter-of-fact. No pity in it, just the easy competence of people who had done it before. Vincent strapped in the safety harness, checking it twice. Then a third time, his earlier shame transformed into fierce protective care, as if Curtis had become something precious that the kid intended to deliver safely or not at all. "Paige," showed him the hand controls. Throttle here, brake here, easy, easy. Treat her gentle till you know her. The white-bearded rider in his 60s leaned in close. "You were 10th Mountain," the old man said. "You climbed mountains with 80 pounds on your back. This is just a mountain that moves." He grinned, gap-toothed. "You got this, soldier." And then Curtis Holloway's hand closed around the throttle, and he twisted it, and the engine answered with a low growl that he felt in his chest, in his ruined spine, in the hollow places 11 years had carved into him. The trike rolled forward across the gravel, slow at first, then onto the smooth asphalt of the access road, then faster. 80 engines roared to life behind him. They flowed out onto the frontage road as the sun touched the horizon. 81 machines in a thundering column with a paralyzed soldier at the front, the wind tearing at his face, the road unspooling ahead of him, gold and endless. The vibration came up through the frame and into his body, into nerves he'd been told for 11 years were dead and silent, and maybe they were, and maybe they weren't. But he felt it. Felt the speed and the air and the great living roar of it the way he had not felt anything in a decade. He was crying now, and laughing at the same time, and he did not care who saw. The valley swept past on either side, the derricks and the dry fields and the long blue shadows of evening, and for the length of that road he was not a man in a chair. He was simply a man, moving fast through a wide and golden world, alive. For 11 years, the world had looked at the chair and written the end of his story. They had all been wrong. Spencer in his golf shirt, the doctors, the strangers who helped him across parking lots, and most of all, the man in the mirror who had believed them. He could still fight. And now, with the wind in his teeth and 80 outlaws at his back, he could still fly. Behind him, framed in the diner window, Spencer Whitfield watched the column thunder away into the sunset. He'd walked in believing he understood exactly what he was looking at. A broken man, a pack of criminals, a world neatly sorted into who mattered and who didn't. He stood there now and understood that he had been the only truly small man in the building all along. Something cold and clarifying had moved through him while he watched 80 feared men kneel in their way before a soldier in a chair. A recognition of his own ugliness so complete, it left him a little sick. He left a $100 bill on the table, more than triple the check, and he did not look anyone in the eye as he went. He sat in his car in the empty lot for a long time before he could trust his hands to drive. The story might have ended there, a single golden evening, a memory to keep against the dark. But that is not what 80 men had built it to be. The trike sat in Curtis's garage that night, and he rolled out 3 times before bed just to put his hand on it, to prove to himself it was real. The next morning, he woke before his alarm for the first time in years. He had a reason to. Russell had left a number. "Call when you're ready to ride for real," he'd said. "We've got room." Curtis told himself he wouldn't. Told himself the evening had been a gift, and gifts were not invitations. Old habits, the shrinking, the keeping small, the not wanting things, died hard. He lasted 4 days. Then he called. That fall, Curtis Holloway rode in his first charity run, not as a passenger, not as a cause, but as a rider. His red trike thundering in a column 300 bikes strong, raising money for wounded veterans up and down the San Joaquin Valley. He learned the riders' names and their stories, and discovered that Russell had been right. Nearly every man in those colors had been written off by somebody, somewhere, judged by the leather before anyone bothered to learn the man. They had built a brotherhood out of refusing to accept other people's small stories about them. It was, Curtis realized, exactly what he had spent 11 years failing to do for himself. He started visiting the VA hospital in Bakersfield, not as a patient, but as the thing none of the doctors could prescribe. He would roll into a ward where some 23-year-old lay staring at a ceiling, just beginning the long arithmetic of a life rearranged, and he would not say a word about strength or courage or hope. He had come to hate those words. They were what people said when they wanted to feel better about leaving. He would just be there, a man in a chair, sharp-eyed and unbroken, living proof that the wheelchair was a chapter and not the whole book. Sometimes he said nothing at all for an hour, just sat with them in the silence, because he remembered how loud the silence had been when he was the one in the bed, and how no visitor had ever been brave enough to simply share it with him. "They told me I was done," a young double amputee said to him once, barely 20, his voice flat with the particular despair Curtis knew from the inside. "They told me that too," Curtis said, 11 years ago. I believed them for 10 of those years." He leaned in. "Don't make my mistake, son. Don't spend a decade agreeing with the people who never knew what you're made of." He pulled a folded photo from his vest. 81 bikes in a sunset column, himself at the front. "I had to be reminded by a bunch of outlaws everybody else was scared of. The whole world crosses the street when they see those patches. Turned out they saw me clearer than my own doctors did, clearer than I saw myself. Funny how that works. The people you're taught to fear and the people who are supposed to help you, sometimes it's the wrong way round entirely." Vincent became something like a younger brother. The kid finished his shovelhead rebuild and rode it up to Curtis's place to show it off, and they spent a Saturday in the garage with the radio on, two men who had both been called nothing by people who didn't know them, building something with their hands instead. Curtis taught him a trick for setting valve lash that he'd learned from his own father, a lifetime and a war ago, and watched the kid's face light up at being trusted with it. Somewhere in that long afternoon, Curtis realized he had stopped counting the years since the war as years of loss. He had started counting forward again. Eleanor put a photo of the whole club crammed into her diner up on the wall behind the register, where it stayed for years, a small monument to the Tuesday everything changed, and travelers would sometimes ask about it, and Eleanor would tell the story, and her voice never quite made it through without catching. A year on, almost to the day, Curtis sat at his window table at Rosie's when the bell rang and Spencer Whitfield walked in. Alone this time. Quieter. He saw Curtis, hesitated, then crossed the room. He did not slouch. He did not smirk. He had lost the easy gloss of a man who had never been told no. In its place was something humbler and more real. The face of someone who had spent a year looking honestly at himself and not entirely liking what he found. "I owe you an apology," Spencer said. "A year overdue. What I said to you, what I was." He stopped, searching. "I think about that day a lot, about what I was sure I knew, and how wrong I had every part of it. I looked at you and saw something broken. I looked at those men and saw something dangerous. And it turned out the only broken, dangerous thing in that room was me, the guy who needed to make a stranger feel small so I could feel big." He shook his head. "I sold the dealerships. I volunteer now at a vet's center out in Fresno. I'm not telling you that for credit. I'm telling you because you're the reason." He swallowed. "You looked me in the eye and said you could still fight. I've been trying to be worth saying something like that ever since." Curtis looked at the man a long moment. The old anger was simply gone, burned clean a year ago on a frontage road at sunset. "Sit down," he said, gesturing at the chair across the table, the same chair Russell had pulled out a year before. "Coffee's good. Eleanor keeps it hot." Spencer sat. And the two men who had walked into that diner a year ago, each wearing a story that wasn't true, the broken soldier who wasn't broken, the strong man who wasn't strong, sat together in the September light and started, slowly, to learn who the other one had been all along. Because that was the lesson 80 Hells Angels had thundered into Curtis Holloway's life and out again. The lesson he carried now to every ward and every run, and every stranger who glanced at his chair and thought they knew. You cannot read a man from the outside. The leather is not the man, the chair is not the man, the golf shirt is not the man. Every person who walks through the door is carrying a story you have not earned the right to tell. And the bravest thing any of them can do, the wounded soldier, the feared outlaw, the small man learning to be larger, is to stop believing the lie the world hands them about who they are, and decide every single morning that the fight is still theirs to win. Curtis Holloway could still fight. In the end, he taught a whole valley how.